Chapter 9. The World at War. My phone rang beside my bed at 3:30 a.m. on a Thursday in late February 2022. It was Nick Castoras, my private secretary. He told me the event we had all been dreading had come to pass. Vladimir Putin had mounted a full-scale assault on Kiev. For months we had known this was likely to happen, but it had been growing more certain by the day. Yet to hear it confirmed was terrible. A ground war in Europe for the first time in decades. It shattered all the illusions we had about European security. Russian forces had been conducting exercises near the border with Ukraine since the spring of 2021, and there had been a further build-up of tanks and troops in the autumn. The US and the UK were privy to the very specific intelligence that Putin was planning to invade Ukraine more or less immediately after the Beijing Winter Olympics were over, and those games had been formally closed the previous Sunday. We had spent the autumn and winter doing all we could to deter an invasion and to persuade the Russian regime that it would be a strategic mistake. The problem was that what looks like irrational to Western politicians can look logical to a dictator. The UK was a galvanizing force in the G7. We were the first European country to send weapons to Ukraine and led on calls for tough sanctions. We called for the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that runs from Russia to Germany to be cancelled. We warned the Russians that Ukraine would fight, and we spelled out the consequences for the Russian people. The UK had already been training up the Ukrainian army since 2015, and Boris, Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, and I were determined to help as much as possible. This involved wading through a lot of Whitehall treacle. The machine was risk-averse and cautious, but we were racing against time to get the weapons over before Russia attacked. A lot of the Foreign Office apparatus that focused on Russia had been disbanded after the end of the Cold War. This included the Information Research Department, which had countered Soviet propaganda. Russia specialists had been relocated to other growing interests like the Middle East and Asia. Many resources had been sucked into international development. We immediately redeployed people and re-established an information unit, which had an important role in countering Russian disinformation. Together with the US, we deliberately released intelligence to smoke out the Russians and expose their tactics. We needed to convince international doubters that they were up to. This was something of a risky tactic, given the inglorious history of published intelligence in the run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, but we knew that Russia was planning all manner of false flag operations to give themselves a pretext for the invasion and muddy the picture. By announcing in advance that we already knew exactly what they intended, we were able to expose those tactics and prevent their disinformation campaign from getting off the ground. It was a massive effort to build capacity in the Foreign Office, especially the sanctions team. They were struggling with the sheer bulk of the work thanks to cumbersome legislation. The Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act had been bastardized during its progress through parliamentary, another example of our failing to streamline our approach after voting to leave the EU. Incredibly, some of the legislators who had made these sanctions difficult to apply had once been in the pay of Russian oligarchs. Lord Panic, for example, had sponsored amendments to the bill in the House of Lords. Panic had previously served as a lawyer to the Russian oligarch Arkady Rotenberg, a close friend of Putin. He had helped in fight from sanctions from the EU following the Russian annexation of Crimea. I found it extraordinarily that this did not receive more scrutiny. Here was a British legislator who had been employed by Russian oligarchs to fight sanctions, who then sought to amend sanctions legislation. By November, it was clear that dealing with Russia was our absolute priority and that our Eastern European allies would be critical. They understood the Russian threat best and were the most at risk. I am a long-standing fan of the Baltic states and Poland. I admire their visceral love of freedom and democracy after having spent so many years under communist terror. Visiting during the 1990s, I saw the energy that a free economy and free society can unleash, and I wish we had more of that spirit in Britain. As a toddler in 1977, My parents took me to spend a year in communist Poland. I was too young to remember our stay, but maybe it embedded an appreciation for Eastern Europe somewhere deep in my psyche. These brave countries were on the frontier of freedom, and I wanted to do all I could to back them. In November, I headed to Tapa, Estonia, where UK troops were stationed barely 2 hours' drive from the Russian border. After greeting our troops, I got into a tank to go see the border. It was minus 10 degrees Celsius and there was deep snow. I didn't envy those stationed out there, but their presence was clearly a vital sign of NATO's collective resolve, and I delivered a strong warning to Putin. We want a free world where freedom and democracy don't just survive, they thrive. To this end, we will stand with our fellow democracies against Russia's malign activity. We will support Ukraine and stability in the Western Balkans to safeguard their security and build their economic resilience. We have seen this playbook from the Kremlin before, when Russia falsely claimed its illegal annexation of Crimea was a response to NATO aggression. NATO is an alliance forged on the principle of defense, not provocation. Any suggestion that NATO is provoking the Russians is clearly false. Any action by Russia to undermine the freedom and democracy that our partners enjoy would be a strategic mistake. True to form, the British media chose to focus more on the photographs of me riding in a tank than on my imminent prospect of war in Europe. From there, I headed on to NATO's summit in Riga, followed the next day by the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, meeting in Stockholm. Tensions between Russia and America were palpable, with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov having a set-to at dinner. I had another meeting with Lavrov the next day. It proved to be as fruitless as the last. As things got worse, I found myself hosting the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting in Liverpool in December 2021. I was determined to do all we could to have a common line on sanctions as a warning to Putin. Russia had to believe this would be much more than a slap on the wrist. That meant sanctioning Russian banks and individuals with connections to Putin, seizing their physical assets, and degrading Russia's economic position to make it a parish state. This was agreed, and we gave public warning that there would be severe consequences if Russia invaded. Importantly, the Japanese backed the approach, showing this was not just a Euro-Atlantic concern, but something of global consequence. Yoshihime Yahasi, the Japanese foreign minister, also showed his musical prowess during the summit as he played Imagine on a replica of John Lennon's piano as the Beatles Story Museum. I confess to Lennon being my favourite Beatle, although he was clearly a lefty. But for a brief moment that night in Liverpool, we revelled in the message of idealism, escapism, and hope. The work didn't stop. Our family's first and last Christmas at Sheving was interspersed with frequent visits from civil servants and secure phone calls, as well as briefing parliamentarians. Mobile phone reception is not great there, and the Foreign Office portable secure devices are best described as inadequate. I spent too much of the Christmas recess hanging out of a bedroom window on the top floor where my brother was staying, trying to hear what Tony Blinken was saying, with two private secretaries crouched next to me. We were on perpetual tenterhooks throughout January. The long-planned 2+2 foreign and defence ministers meeting in Australia was vital for the progress of us AUKUS pact and our submarine deal with Australia and the US. However, it was under constant threat of being terminated by panicky officials calling from London. Regrettably, by this stage, we pretty much knew war was inevitable. We had intelligence that this was not going to be just another assault on the Donbas, the likes of which had been ongoing since Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. It was going to be a full-blown attack on Kiev, but my G7 colleagues and I refused to give up hope. We committed to putting as much pressure on Moscow as we could while helping Ukrainian prepare. I visited Moscow on the 9th of February to urge Russia to pull back from the brink. The trip almost didn't happen. I had been laid low with COVID, and had therefore been unable to join Boris's visit to Kiev the previous week. In fact, I was only given the COVID all clear at the Northolt Royal Air Force Base minutes before we took off. Moscow was eerily normal. You could have been in any European city with crowded streets and a buzzing nightlife. I spent 4 hours in the Foreign Ministry with Lavrov, where he spouted the same propaganda about the West and NATO while serving borscht and vodka. In a sign that Russia hadn't quite extinguished all remaining freedoms, he smoked heavy cigarettes throughout. He continued to deny Russia had any plans whatsoever to invade Ukraine. I challenged him on the sheer scale of their troop build-up near the border, but he merely responded that it was regrettable to be asked to withdraw troops from his country's own territory. He then had a press conference. Its purpose, from my point of view, was to make sure that the Russian people were aware of our concerns and the warnings we were issuing. Of course, the Kremlin propagandists tried to undermine me, and regrettably much of the British press was only too happy to oblige them by running stories amplifying Russian propaganda instead of challenging the increasingly absurd denial of reality on the part of the Russians. It was disheartening, to say the least, to see reputable British media outlets lazily repeating the personal attacks Lavrov hurled in my direction. Unfortunately, useful idiots in the Western media do a lot of our enemies' work for them. I felt it was important to visit Kiev as well as Moscow to support our allies in their hour of need. This was not welcomed by the powers that be at the Ministry of Defense. They did not like the idea of the foreign minister, secretary, and whatnot going into what was likely soon to be a war zone. There had already been a lot of pressure on us by risk-averse officials to move our ambassador out of Kiev, against which I held out again and again. We pushed forward with the Kiev visit and set out from Breeze Norton on the 17th of February to meet Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. Our plane was an RAF transporter with just a few seats next to the pilot. We were told there was going to be a no-go decision as we approached Ukrainian airspace, which was all very dramatic. We reached that point, nothing happened, and we made it through. The city of Kiev seemed rather empty. When we got to the Foreign Ministry, I found Dmytro holed up in his office with cigars and Mozart Kugeln, a specialty chocolate from Salzburg. I was struck by his utter resolution. He recalled the Maidan Revolution of 2014, where the Ukrainian people had stood up for freedom against the regime, seeking closer ties with Moscow. People had gone to Independence Square in Kiev, knowing that protesters had already been shot dead by riot police. Yet they went anyway in a show of defiance and succeeded in getting the old regime overthrown. We lit a candle at the Holodomor Victims Memorial Hall in honor of the nearly 5 million who perished during the terrible famine inflicted by Stalin on the people of Ukraine. Westerners may have forgotten about the hideous crimes of communism, but in Ukraine, they had not. I was more convinced than ever that Putin would face unbreakable resistance. Back at the Foreign Ministry, I gave a brief speech and held an impromptu press conference in the foyer with the assembled international press pack before heading back to London. It was probably the strangest day trip I had ever undertaken. The next day, I headed to the Munich Security Conference. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky gave a powerful and brilliant address in which he reminded those present that it was at the same event 15 years earlier that Putin had made his expansionist speech attacking NATO and signaling his intention to turn away from the West. The response of world leaders then, Zelensky said, had been appeasement. The direct result, he said, had been the annexation of Crimea and further aggression against Ukraine. It was hard to disagree. Despite this, some of our allies were still in denial that the Russians would invade Ukraine. Others did not believe it would be a full frontal attack on Kiev, but rather more of the same tactic used in the Donbas region. Again, I collaborated with Eastern European nations such as Poland to get the message across and put the whole of Europe on full alert. The only problem with getting around Munich was US Vice President Kamala Harris's cavalcade of nearly 30 vehicles. I don't think the Americans understand how much these immense travel-blocking motorcades annoy representatives of other countries, or maybe they don't care. The day after the Munich conference closed, Putin made his speech formally recognizing the Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine in the Donbas as Soviet states. This was clearly a precursor to sending in troops, which he announced the following day. Even then, there was a sense of disbelief among our allies, not just because it was too awful to contemplate, but because all rational sense told them that it would be a crazy thing for Russia to do. As we soon discovered, rational sense was no barrier to Putin. Those last few nights in the lead up to the invasion were tense, as all we could do was wait. Following the invasion in the early hours of the 24th of February, I rushed into the Foreign Office, rolled out the sanctions regime we had spent the last few months putting in place, and made a statement to the House of Commons. I ended the day with a video conference with Ukraine's foreign and defense ministers. Their fortitude had been amazing. None of the Ukrainian cabinet had left the country, despite the US offering them an escape route. The next few weeks were round the clock. I was constantly on WhatsApp, making phone calls and holding meetings, coordinating sanctions, statements, votes at the UN, even sourcing ammunition. Despite their earlier skepticism, allies such as France and Germany joined the effort, with Chancellor Olaf Scholz declaring the end of Germany's historic policy of change through trade in relation to Russia. In Britain, we sanctioned Russian banks and seized the assets of those with connections to Putin and his regime. I travelled to Vilnius, numerous NATO meetings in Brussels, the UNHCR in Switzerland, and the ICC in the Netherlands. We visited Warsaw and our aid centre in Razov. I also travelled to The Hague and various G7 meetings in Germany, as well as an informal NATO meeting in Berlin. Along with the Americans and Canadians, I even attended a European Union foreign ministers meeting. Our disputes with the EU were overshadowed by this threat to our way of life. There was less harmony within the Conservative Party back in Britain. In November, the so-called Partygate story had broken in the press. These were accusations surrounding gatherings that had apparently taken place on Boris's watch at 10 Downing Street in the breach of COVID regulations on social distancing. An inquiry led by Sue Gray was commissioned. There was a drip, drip, drip of stories in the press. Conservative MPs started to get angsty and opinion polls ratings slipped. However, MPs were also careful not to disrupt the UK's leadership on the war in Ukraine. In the months that followed, Russian troops failed to make the expected progress against the courageous Ukrainian resistance. We and our Western allies stepped up to provide military aid and assistance, and I was constantly advocating that we do more weapons, more planes, more tanks, whatever it took to defeat Russia and drive them out of Ukraine. Foreign ministers became a very tight-knit group, especially those of us in the G7 who were coordinating the sanctions and in daily contact. We were constantly fighting with our treasuries to get the toughest possible sanctions packages and pushing to go further and faster. Despite being from different political stripes, including a German Green, a Canadian Liberal, an Italian five-star populist, and a British Conservative, we were adamant Russia would lose. Europe was casting off its previous appeasement attitude to Russia, which was particularly tough for the Germans. I greatly admire them for that. There was a strand of idealism and hope, and at the apex were the Ukrainians themselves. In the run-up to and through the early stages of the war, there was still a tendency, personified in particular by French President Macron, to believe we should engage with Putin. Many long phone calls were made. I was determined to prevent another German and French brokered Minsk-style agreement, which had led to the disastrous situation we were in. The UK and the US had to be involved. We set up a UK negotiations team to back the Ukrainians and sent in our top officials. I did as much as I could, making a series of speeches to push for further support for Ukraine and to dampen calls for a negotiated statement. There was also a misguided fear of escalation. On various occasions, I would discover attempts to water down my lines, which I believed to be down to pressure from the US State Department. Foreign officials were frequently on the phone to their US counterparts. Sometimes they would tell me this as they were the new language had come from. Sometimes they would not. Yet I remained steadfast in my belief that Russia should be held to account and contained for the future. The Ukrainians should not be forced to give up any territory, including Crimea, and we should supply everything the Ukrainians needed, including tanks and planes. It was clear that if they weren't dealt with, our countries would fall victim. I laid out my approach in a speech at the Mansion House in March. Some argue we shouldn't provide heavy weapons for fear of provoking something worse, but my view is the inaction would be the greatest provocation. This is a time for courage, not for caution. We are doubling down. We will keep going further and faster to push Russia out of the whole of Ukraine. Russia's malign influence wasn't just on Ukraine. The Russian-funded mercenary Wagner Group was destabilizing Africa. The Balkans were also under immense pressure from Russia and Chinese influence, as I was to see on a visit to Sarajevo, where it was increasingly clear to me that, for example, Russia was seeking to undermine reforms taking place in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where fueling sensationists, it seems that whenever you looked, the West's uneasy policy of appeasement was resulting in instability. In June and July, I was constantly on the move, jetting from one summit or meeting to another. I was beginning to lose my rag at this stage due to the constant travel and pressure. On one particularly difficult morning, I was delayed by half an hour for an event with the Australian Prime Minister and the Spanish President due to roads being closed off for Biden presidential motorcade. I started to jump out of my car to remonstrate with the Spanish police and had to be dragged back in by Nick, my private secretary. After a cooling off period by a sherry bar, I then flew to Paris to engage in further talks at the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry. Each time I touched down in the UK, the domestic political situation seemed to have got worse. More revelations were emerging about so-called Partygate. Meanwhile, Conservative MP and government whip Chris Pincher had allegedly been caught engaging in drunken, unwanted groping, and there were disputes about who knew what about his alleged past behaviour at the time Boris had appointed him to government. I had been an early supporter of Boris in both the 2016 and 2019 leadership elections and continued to believe he was the best leader for the party. While I had been frustrated by his decision to raise taxes, I knew what had been pursued, mainly by Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, whose influence was at the root of several other missteps by the government. What I wanted was for Boris to deliver on the promises of the 2019 manifesto, on which we had won our large majority. I was dismayed when he and the whole government got bogged down in the Partygate and Pincher allegations. Yet I still couldn't believe Conservative MPs would be stupid enough to depose Boris, who had achieved such a convincing win at the 2019 general election. I evidently had my head in the sand. On Monday the 4th of July, at the start of what turned out to be a critical week, I was in Lugano in Switzerland for the Ukraine Recovery Conference. I was then back in London for just a day and could sense something was wrong, as I wandered around Parliament. But I got on with my day, and at 6 p.m. went to brief the Eurosceptic Caucus, the European Research Group, on my negotiations with the EU. Just as Sir Ian Duncan Smith was kicking off the meeting, everyone started looking at their phones. The Health Secretary, Javid Javid, had resigned, calling on Boris to quit. I looked at Ian, and we decided to persevere with the meeting. 10 minutes later, everyone was looking at their phones again. Chancellor Rishi Sunak had now resigned as well. At that point, it became clear the meeting was pointless, and MPs scuttled off to try to figure out what was going on. The atmosphere was febrile, and events were moving fast. I was due to get on a plane early the next morning, destined for the G20 foreign ministers meeting in Indonesia, and the question was whether I should still go. To me, it seemed quite clear. The Foreign Secretary pulling out of a major international summit would signal that the government was not functioning. I had a job to do, and it was my duty to get on with it. However, I couldn't have been headed to a more inconvenient location. Bali is an 18-hour flight from London, and the government aircraft on which I was travelling had to refuel several times during the journey. The Wi-Fi on board was sporadic, and it was hard to keep track of the rapid developments back home. Every time we touched down to refuel, more hysterical messages arrived on my phone in the wake of further ministerial resignations. I discussed with my team whether we should return home, but opted to keep on to Indonesia. We eventually arrived in Bali at what was essentially a holiday resort. I tried to continue with the planned program of bilateral meetings, but events in the UK were a major distraction, and not just to me. The other foreign ministers were all gripped by the headlines coming out of Westminster throughout Wednesday. I have found this to be a common theme during international diplomacy, where discussion of domestic political troubles can provide a form of light relief. At times, it almost resembles a group therapy session, allowing us to share our troubles and complaints, but on this occasion, there was not much sharing by the others. They wanted to ask me what on earth was going on back at home in the UK. It was the following morning, UK time, that the news broke that Boris was going to resign. While it had started to look inevitable, I received no advance notice. Because of the 7-hour time difference, it was already the afternoon for me, and in between meetings, I received floods of messages from colleagues in London telling me to get back urgently. When I returned to my hotel room that evening, I turned on the TV to see Boris standing in Downing Street, delivering his resignation statement live to the world. I know now that I had no choice but to return to Britain. With my boss deposed, any remaining credibility I had at the meeting was draining away fast, and I had to look to the future. As one of my foreign minister counterparts at the summit WhatsApped me, "Get back home, woman, and start hustling." This was easier said than done. The problem was that our government plane wasn't ready. The crew needed to be complete, their mandated rest time, so they would not be able to fly until the next morning, and a commercial flight was not immediately available that evening. So I found myself stranded in paradise with the run of this beautiful romantic beach resort with my civil servants and special advisor desperate to leave as the starting gun was being fired on the leadership contest 7,000 miles away. As I walked along the beach in Indonesia, I started crying. Whatever happened, I knew this period of intense teamwork with fellow travellers from across the free world was over. I knew I would be waving goodbye to the Foreign Office and some of the best people I have ever worked with. I would miss them. I also knew the flight of the future of the Conservative Party would be much less idealistic and much murkier. I knew it would be brutal, but I felt compelled to do it, and yet there was so much unfinished business at the Foreign Office. We had started to question the post-Cold War policy consensus, but we had not followed through on the full logic of our approach to China and Iran. The speech President Zelensky made in Munich on the eve of the war laid this out. That city was the perfect location for him to call out the appeasement by the West of an aggressor with territorial ambitions in Europe. For Britain, the Munich Agreement between Chamberlain and Hitler now stands as a mark of naivety and weakness. By failing to stand up to Nazi Germany early enough, we invited the horrors of the Second World War. Now, after failing to stand up to Putin's Russia, we were seeing the inevitable results. A fatal complacency befell the West in the 1990s when we thought the battle for ideas had been won. The failure to push Russia in the right direction has cost us dearly. The lack of a serious and united response by the West to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 was obviously a massive error and a moral failing. Barack Obama and David Cameron did not participate in the Normandy Accords, leaving it instead to the Germans and French to negotiate with Russia. The end result? The Minsk Protocol, effectively ceded power to Russia over Ukrainian land. The constant refrain we have heard from the Western foreign policy establishment is that engagement is the key. that closer economic and trading links will inevitably lead to peace and harmony and to Russia's becoming a modern and liberal democracy. I think we can now conclude that this was a misplaced hope. Even after all we have seen, the voices of appeasement remain loud, because Putin has not been shy about making bellicose threats. Many in the foreign policy establishment have taken up the mantra that we must at all costs avoid escalation, for fear of provoking a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. This has clearly hampered the West's response in Ukraine, and Putin has used that to his advantage. He knows that despite our toughest rhetoric, his possession of nuclear weapons makes an overt military engagement by the West unthinkable in the eyes of many. If we take the view that it is possible for Western nations to engage militarily with a country because it possesses nuclear weapons, then we should prepare ourselves for plenty more incursions into Soviet territory. The only thing an aggressor like Putin understands is strength, and we cannot be cowed by his threats and nuclear saber ranting. This is an issue that we in the free world need to confront head on. At almost every point in the current conflict, Putin has drawn red lines backed by apocalyptic threats. He said Sweden and Finland joining NATO was a red line. He said the US supplying tanks to Ukraine was a red line. In all of these cases, he has been proved to be bluffing. All of this rhetoric is designed to scare us off, and it is part of a deliberate strategy. Fundamentally, you have two alternatives when faced with aggressors. You either take them on, or you hold back from confrontation because you're scared of what they will do. However you dress it up, the second option is simply appeasement. If we give in to it, then we deserve to be known as the modern men and women of Munich. I fear we are making the same mistakes with China that we did with Russia. Western nations have persisted in the notion that deepening economic ties will lead to better outcomes, ignoring the very real evidence this has not happened. We have not woken up sufficiently to the threat China possesses to our interests and values, as starkly demonstrated by its genocide of the Uyghurs in treatment of Hong Kong. More worryingly, we have given the impression that we will equivocate as to whether to stand in defense of an independent country under threat from a nuclear superpower. Providing arms and financial support only goes so far, and we have shown that the calls to avoid escalation will always hold us back from matching the strength of our enemies. With Iran waiting for the regime to sign the JCPOA while they were backing terrorists like Hamas, which is committing appalling atrocities in Israel, and developing their own nuclear capability, has proved to be a mistake. Ultimately, appeasement does not work. History has shown this time and time again. The understandable urge to avoid conflict has meant we will too often tolerate outrageous aggression, sell out those we should protect, and hope that by doing so we will contain the problem and preserve peace. The evidence that our enemies are moving against us has been plain for many years. Hostile acts by the Russians and the Chinese state interests have targeted us, whether in the field of economic or cyber warfare. The threat of military action has also been shown to be all too real. The West has to get serious about the new Cold War in which we find ourselves. Our enemies understand that. Russia, China, and Iran are working together to destabilize the West and undermine our way of life. Yet we are still undercutting each other to trade with them. We are harming our own economic interests to export jobs to China in the name of net zero. We have been allowing infiltration and censorship. As I write this, a suspected spy is being investigated after allegedly gaining access to the chairman of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee. The escalation of aggression by our foes calls out for renewed leadership, and this has to start with the leader of the free world, the United States of America, as well as assembling an economic NATO to take on China in the same way allies took on the USSR. More has to be done. The US must be fearless. It must rein and build defense capabilities. We also need a new era of European leadership. This means listening to our Eastern European allies. It means rearming and spending more on defense. It means cutting off our economic dependency on China, and it means an end to the appeasement of Iran. The conflict has already begun. Our enemies are already fighting it. The only question is whether we take them on or allow them to win by default.